So in today's video, I'm sharing how to manage the grieving process without making yourself wrong. But if you're new, my name's Michelle Ferris. I'm a psychotherapist and I love helping people create relationships that work. So the grieving process actually starts when we anticipate the loss, not when the loss has actually happened. It's when we get that initial news that a loved one is sick, or they're moving, or the relationship has ended. So in this video, I'm going to share how you can go through the 5 stages of grief successfully without making yourself wrong. So about a year ago, one of my family members got diagnosed with a terminal illness, and it changed everything. So at first, I was in total shock. This person was incredibly healthy, and there was absolutely no indication that he would get sick. And part of what I'm going to share with you is my own process and what that looks like in terms of stages of grief. So denial is often the first stage of grief. This is when we experience shock and dismay, and we just can't really comprehend what's happening. And the reason that happens is because denial protects us from absorbing a reality that we may not be able to do immediately. When we get any type of devastating news like this, it takes us a while to absorb the reality of that. So in the next month, I really struggled with really wrapping my head around the diagnosis and what that meant. But what made it easier is I understood that denial is part of the stages of grief. And so part of what makes grief easier is knowing what to expect. So in that denial phase, you're going to be off-center. Emotionally, you may go from feeling a lot of feelings to feeling completely numb. Some people really beat themselves up in grief because they can't access their emotions. But that's just your body's way of protecting you from a reality you can't face yet. Because when we get this kind of devastating news in our life, it is a shock to your system, and it's really important to honor that. And that's part of what I did, was I got everything off my plate that I could, and I gave myself some time to go be with my loved one, help them, and also be able to take care of myself in the process. So when you're in the phase of denial, everything sort of feels surreal. You may walk around in slow motion. And again, it's not because you're doing it wrong, it's because it's taking a lot of energy to absorb this new reality. And often that takes months. So what I really want you to know in the denial stage of grief is that you need to let it unfold the way it is. There's no timetable here. I had to stay in the denial phase until I could start to move on. Now the next stage is bargaining. So bargaining is when we go back and forth wanting a different outcome. We're wanting to control it. We're wishing things were different. We're praying for a miracle. We're blaming ourselves maybe for what we did or didn't do. All of that is the bargaining stage, because that's also a part of grief, is that you have to forgive yourself for what you did and didn't do. Because here's the thing, everyone grieves differently. Some people are going to be highly emotional. Some people are not. Some people want to be around other people and they need a lot of support. Some people prefer to be alone. Some people are going to use food or alcohol or other substances to cope. Some are going to dive headfirst into their recovery because they know they need more. Some may need additional support. You also might gaslight yourself and tell yourself, oh my gosh, I shouldn't be having this feeling. This shouldn't be this painful. I must be doing something wrong. So I think there's an aspect of our grief that we can really blame ourselves, when really it's the intensity of the grief that's really hard to manage. And I know for me, I've had to give myself a lot of slack in the process of grieving, because grief is hard. There's no way around that. But accepting that actually helps. Because the most important thing you can do in the grieving process is to let it happen naturally. Don't judge yourself for it. Don't compare yourself to what other people are feeling or what other people are doing or how productive they're being when you can't be. Because grief is a highly individual process, and it's really based on your own history, your own coping mechanisms. There's a lot of factors that go into how we grieve, but they're not marks against you. If you're struggling in grief right now, say me too in the comments, because I'm right there with you and I'm hoping this video will help. So the other part of grief is that it can often make you feel powerless and hopeless. And if you have a belief in a higher power, it may cause you to question or lose faith. And this can also be a part of the depression stage of grief. You might feel more sad and overwhelmed and just in general hopeless about life. your energy is likely going to be a lot lower. You might find yourself doing one errand and then being totally wiped out and having to go home. That's actually normal. I've had that experience several times in grief where I really can't expect myself to do the same level of exercise or the same level of tasks in my daily life. And that's okay to give yourself permission to slow down during the grieving process, because that's probably what it's going to take for you to be able to heal and cope better. The other thing with grief is that it comes and goes in waves. I'm fine for a moment, and then the next moment I'm crying, or I'm really missing him. Because grief comes in waves, and it can come when you least expect it. You might be watching TV and something triggers a memory, or maybe the holidays are coming and you're really afraid of going through the holidays without your loved one. These are all really common occurrences that happen in grief. So one thing I'll say about the depression stage is that it's really important to let yourself feel sad. And if you're having trouble doing this, sometimes what I recommend for my clients is to just allot 5 or 10 minutes for you to sit and cry. And just give yourself that time to feel sad and to grieve. Because believe it or not, that's going to help you feel better. Because holding back the grief is where the pain is and where we create our own suffering without knowing it. Now, the next stage of grief is anger. And this is where we might be angry at the loss. We might blame our higher power or God. That's an important part of grief, to just let yourself feel angry. You might find that you're more irritable with your partner or family members. You might want to isolate because you're so angry you don't really want to talk about it. So part of what I would recommend is doing some writing where you can get all that anger out without hurting yourself or other people. Because anger is a natural part of loss. And allowing yourself to just feel that anger is the quickest way for it to lessen and to move on to something else. You want to get all that energy of grief and sadness out, because the more you bottle it in, the more it's going to likely hurt you in the long run. Because I know a lot of people tend to want to avoid their grief. And I've known several people over the years that have avoided their grief, but 20 years later, they're still struggling with it. Whereas people I know that have really gone through their grief and let themselves plummet into those feelings until they were done, were much healthier in the long run. I know for me, when I lost my dad, I was about 24, and it took 2 solid years of grieving before I really came out of it. But I came out of it strong because I let myself feel it for a solid 2 years. And I got a lot of support. And that's what I want for you, is to give yourself the time it takes to grieve, because there is no timetable that works for everyone. So in the first 4 stages, denial, bargaining, depression, and anger, they're not linear stages, which means you're going to bounce from one to another, which is why grief is so hard. One minute I might be sad, the next minute I might be angry and irritable, the next minute I might want to deny the loss altogether. Because allowing yourself to feel whatever comes up is going to be your quickest way to heal. So the acceptance is the final stage of the grieving process. And this is where you can accept the reality of what happened. You're never going to like it, but you can accept that the loss happened and now you need to move forward. And this is where you're not constantly thinking about it. You're not constantly struggling with depression. You're able to start enjoying life again, even if it's in small amounts. Because when I've done my grief, it's taken a lot to get to the acceptance stage, but that's when I know I've done my work. Like, I can look at pictures of my dad and be totally fine. Once in a great while, I'll shed some tears, but not often, because I let myself grieve. I didn't shortcut the process. And I know with this one that I'm currently in, I'm going to do the same thing. No matter what it looks like, I am going to be there for myself and my family, because it does hurt to lose somebody you love, and we can only absorb it a little bit at a time. So another aspect of acceptance is being able to accept that you couldn't control the outcome, that it was going to happen the way it was going to happen. And that's probably the hardest part of grief, is really accepting that sometimes bad things happen and we just have to hang on. So I want to give you some suggestions for how to cope with grief. One, definitely consider joining a grief group. That was one of the best things I did when I lost my dad, because none of my friends lost a parent yet. I felt really isolated in my experience. And joining a grief group really gave me a place where other people got it, because the members in the group understood my experience better than anyone, and that helped me heal. Friends and family are great, but they may not know what to say to you, especially if they tend to avoid their own intense feelings of grief. So joining a grief group can really give you that place to grieve and to heal. So the next thing you can do is increase your self-care. This is the time to say no to obligations, volunteer opportunities, all of that stuff, because you're gonna need your energy to go through this grieving process. So this is the time to allow yourself to do less and give yourself permission to say no. The next thing you can do is consider getting some individual therapy. Therapy can be a really good place to get one-on-one support. So another thing you can do is to create a little altar in your home. This might include a candle, a photo of your loved one, some mementos, and it can become your place to go and cry and grieve. Because sometimes having a special place of remembrance for our loved one can really help. So the next thing I want you to do is I want you to go watch my video on self-care, because that's gonna be your next step. Thanks so much.